It was a stormy night and Sarah found herself alone in her old, creaky house. Her parents had gone out for the evening, leaving her with strict instructions to lock up and stay safe. As the wind howled outside and the rain drummed against the windows, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She tried to distract herself by watching TV, but the flickering images only added to her sense of isolation. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind sent shivers down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Deciding to make herself some dinner, Sarah ventured into the kitchen. As she chopped vegetables, she couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every shadow seemed to dance with malevolent intent, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. After dinner, Sarah retreated to her room, hoping that sleep would offer some respite from her mounting fear. But as she lay in bed, the darkness seemed to press in around her, suffocating and oppressive. Just as she was about to drift off, she heard it, a soft, insidious whispering that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Heart-pounding, Sarah sat up in bed, straining to make out the words. They were unintelligible, a jumble of syllables that sent a cold chill down her spine. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for her phone, desperate for some semblance of connection to the outside world. But as she fumbled with the screen, she realized with a sinking feeling that she had no signal. She was truly alone, cut off from help or escape. As the whispering grew louder, Sarah felt a rising sense of panic. She knew she had to get out of the house, to escape whatever malevolent force was closing in on her. Clutching her phone like a lifeline, she crept out of bed and tiptoed towards the door. But as she reached for the handle, she froze. A sudden, gut-wrenching fear washed over her, paralyzing her in place. She could feel something watching her, something dark and hungry that lurked just beyond the threshold. With a trembling hand, Sarah reached for the light switch, flooding the room with harsh, artificial light. But as the darkness retreated, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye, a shadowy figure lurking in the corner of the room, its eyes glinting with malevolent intent. With a strangled cry, Sarah turned and fled, racing down the stairs and out into the stormy night. Behind her, she could hear the whispering growing louder, more insistent, as though the darkness itself was reaching out to claim her. But Sarah refused to look back. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, until she could no longer hear the whispering or feel the oppressive weight of the darkness. And as she stumbled into the safety of the streetlights, she knew that she had escaped the clutches of whatever malevolent force had haunted her home. But as she looked back at the darkened windows of her house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. That somewhere in the depths of the shadows something was waiting for her, biding its time until it could claim her as its own. In the eerie quiet of the night, young Emily found herself alone in her family's large, creaky house. Her parents had left for a weekend getaway, leaving her in the care of her older brother, Jack. However, Jack had unexpectedly fallen ill and had to be taken to the hospital, leaving Emily all by herself. As darkness enveloped the house, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over her. She tried to distract herself by watching TV in the living room, but every creak and rustle seemed amplified in the empty house. With a shiver, Emily decided to retreat to her room upstairs. The staircase groaned under her weight as she ascended, each step echoing loudly in the silent house. She reached her room and closed the door behind her, trying to ignore the sense of isolation that threatened to overwhelm her. Turning on her bedside lamp, Emily tried to lose herself in a book. However, as she read, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to dance and twist, taking on sinister shapes in the dim light. As the night wore on, Emily's nerves began to fray. She heard strange noises coming from the walls, scratching, tapping, whispers that seemed to echo from the darkest corners of the house. She convinced herself it was just her imagination, but the fear gnawed at her insides. Unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere of her room any longer, Emily decided to venture downstairs for a glass of water. The house seemed to loom over her as she descended the staircase, its darkened hallways stretching out like a labyrinth. Reaching the kitchen, Emily quickly filled a glass with water from the tap. But as she turned to leave, she froze. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a shadowy silhouette that seemed to blend seamlessly with the darkness. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the figure, unable to move. The silhouette lingered for a moment before dissipating into thin air, leaving Emily alone once more. Trembling, Emily retreated to her room, locking the door behind her. She huddled under the covers, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. What had she seen? Was it a trick of the light, or something more sinister? As the first light of dawn crept through her window, Emily finally dared to venture out of her room. She found the house bathed in a soft, golden glow, the shadows retreating to the corners where they belonged. With a sigh of relief, Emily realized that the darkness that had plagued her night had been nothing more than a trick of the mind. But as she glanced back at the staircase, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't been alone after all, that something had been watching her, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And so, with a lingering sense of unease, Emily vowed never to spend another night alone in her family's house, not if she could help it. For in the darkness, where shadows reign supreme, anything is possible, and the line between reality and nightmare blurs into nothingness. The wind whispered through the old, creaky house as if carrying secrets from its murky past. Sarah stood alone in the dimly lit hallway, her heart pounding with every echoing footstep she took. Her parents had left for a weekend getaway, leaving her in charge of the eerie house nestled deep in the woods. As the shadows danced around her, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She tried to dismiss it as her imagination running wild in the silence of the night. But each creak of the floorboards and every rustle of the curtains seemed to confirm her fears. With a nervous gulp, Sarah retreated to the safety of her room, locking the door behind her. She flicked on the bedside lamp, its warm glow offering a semblance of comfort amidst the darkness. But the sense of unease lingered like a heavy fog. As Sarah tried to distract herself with a book, strange noises echoed through the house. It started as faint whispers, barely audible over the howling wind outside. But soon, the whispers grew louder, morphing into chilling laughter that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. Fear gnawed at her insides as she hugged her knees to her chest, desperately wishing for her parents' return. But they were miles away, unaware of the terror unfolding in their absence. Just as Sarah's panic reached its peak, the laughter abruptly ceased, plunging the house into an eerie silence once more. But the respite was short-lived, shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps echoing from the floor below. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she tiptoed to the top of the staircase, straining to see through the darkness below. The hallway below remained empty, the only movement coming from the flickering light bulb swinging gently from the ceiling. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for her phone, intending to call for help. But her fingers froze as she noticed the battery icon flashing red, signaling its imminent demise. Trapped in the darkness with no means of communication, Sarah felt a wave of despair wash over her. As if sensing her fear, the house seemed to come alive around her, its ancient walls whispering secrets long forgotten. Shadows danced in the corners of her vision, taking on sinister shapes that seemed to mock her terror. With no other option, Sarah made a dash for the front door, her pulse racing with each step. But as she reached for the handle, a chilling voice echoed through the house, freezing her in place. "Leaving so soon, Sarah?" the voice hissed, its icy tone sending a shiver down her spine. Sarah turned slowly, her eyes widening in horror as she came face to face with the source of the voice. A shadowy figure stood at the end of the hallway, its features obscured by darkness. With a silent scream, Sarah turned and fled, her footsteps echoing through the empty house as she raced towards the safety of the outside world. But as she burst through the front door and into the cold night air, she knew that the horrors of midnight echoes would haunt her forever.